Hello! This is the video presentation portion of my discussion 3. Now, my written outline for discussion 3 dealt more with Indigenous language as well as Indigenous healing practices. However, for this presentation, I'm going to focus on the subjects of Indigenous language as well as land-based education practices. So what is a land-based education practice? It is actually something that assumes an environmental approach to learning that requires the deep relationship and connection between Indigenous people and the land. Now, John Hanson, who is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Saskatchewan, who actually specializes in the field of Indigenous justice, he talks in depth about land-based education in his journal article, Cree Elders' Perspective on Land-Based Education. He says of land-based education that the challenge rests in the fact that Indigenous-based models of education require more from the learner than simply studying culture from a textbook. Now, a great example of this type of teaching is how Indigenous people would teach language. So for centuries, Indigenous languages were taught through oral tradition, so they were passed down through word of mouth. Now, when colonization happened, this and other facets of Indigenous culture were attacked and erased. This is spoken about in the documentary The Race to Save Cherokee. In residential schools, like the ones they talk about in the documentary, there was somebody who talked about their personal experience of having their language erased. And they say that they spoke Cherokee at home amongst their family and amongst their friends. However, when they went to school, it was a very different situation. They said that the keeper of the school would punish us if we did not speak English. So this was also unfortunately common in other residential schools as well here in Canada. This specific example that I have is actually St. Margaret's that was located on what is now the Couchiching First Nation Reserve, which is up in Fort Frances, Ontario. I actually went to the reservation to speak in person with Glenn Jourdain, and he is a historian of residential schools, specifically St. Margaret's, and he was also a student there. And his father was also a student there, the first iteration of the school, but he actually didn't know that until they were cleaning out the school and he found an old list of students who had attended. His father never talked about it because it was such a source of shame for him. He also stopped speaking Ojibwe in the home, which meant that Jourdain was never able to learn it through oral tradition. He talked to me about how his father would never speak Ojibwe at home, but he was hired by the police to actually translate Ojibwe into English for them. So it must have been such a cognitive dissonance to have been punished at school for speaking his language and yet receive monetary compensation for it later on in his adult life. Now, this phenomena of cognitive dissonance is all too common for Indigenous people, where they are punished for speaking the language and yet also congratulated for it. Now, something that has been utilized to teach now, currently, are camps and schools. Now, they talk about this in the documentary, The Race to Save Cherokee, and they talk about sorry, not the documentary, but there has actually been talk of adding Indigenous languages to the Ontario curriculum for students who are in kindergarten or the first grade. Now, there's also a huge pressure on young people to pass down Indigenous languages as well as culture. And so that's why when it was brought up in class, that there was a point of contention between elders and young people, whereby the young people would like to store the language in electronic databases, but elders don't. I was confused and surprised by this until I started to do some research into different models of teaching, and then it made sense. So when Hansen talks about land-based practices, he talks about incorporating the environment, incorporating the cultural values into the language teaching. But definitely this is not something that happens in colonial models of schooling. The colonial model that I'm talking about is the Prussia model, which is also known as the factory model of schooling. This is something that was started by somebody named Horace Mann. He actually pushed for education to be mandatory back in 1918 in America. And of course, the manifest function of school is to teach social norms. So colonial norms are very different and often oppress the norms of Indigenous cultures. And so if that's something that is being practiced in those schools, that's not going to be an open, understanding place where land-based practices are going to be included in any kind of language teaching. So that is why traditionally teaching Indigenous languages really clashes with the current model of schooling that exists now. And also there has been talk of adding the languages to databases in universities. And that's also holds a lot of contention for people, because university databases can only be accessed by people who go to those specific universities. And oftentimes, because of socio-economic reasons and racism and oppression, statistically Indigenous people are not as likely to attend a university, nor are they going to be the people who are going to be developing curriculum. So whatever is put into that database may not actually be created by an Indigenous person who understands those cultural norms and values and who could pass that on. Libraries are a different kind of electronic database that is more easily accessible, more universally accessible. However, there's still the same argument there, where the context of the language would be lost, and it wouldn't be a land-based education system, which could also pass on the culture and value of Indigenous people. So it's my opinion that it is best to educate people of Indigenous languages through schools taught by this land-based education system. That way there would not only be the language passed down, but there would also be cultural practices, drum circles, ceremonies, etc. And obviously bar to that would be funding. So that would be something that as a social service worker, I would push to advocate for funding for programs like that, because it's incredibly important that Indigenous languages and culture and the context that they belong in are preserved and passed down. So that would be something that I would want to advocate for in my career. Also, I'm going to be able to utilize this knowledge when to understand it and be more culturally sensitive of Indigenous people, not only for language practices, but how important the cultural context, somebody's perspective, understanding the world is so incredibly shaped by their language and their cultural norms. And to understand somebody better is to understand their culture better. So that would definitely be something that I could utilize in my future career. So thank you so much for watching the presentation portion of my video. I very much enjoyed learning about land-based practices and about Indigenous languages in class. So thank you very much.